I want to welcome all of you to the study as we're continuing on our theme of wisdom. And we've seen that there are a number of components to wisdom. Actually, we were looking at 7 aspects of wisdom, so that when we put those together, we see, first of all, we've already done then this introduction to wisdom. So that was the first part of the series that we did. And just to contextualize that for you on the website, then, if we go to weekly studies, and by the way, this is how you join a weekly study. Just push that button and then you go to that. But if you go to the weekly studies and Sunday morning study, what we've done then, we've been doing wisdom. And first it was this overview of wisdom, but now we're zooming in on, after Proverbs, on Job. So we did that, and then Proverbs, Job. Then we're going to really be looking at some of the wisdom psalms because it's a subgenre. And again, it gives us the temporal versus the eternal perspective. And then an overview of Ecclesiastes. And so when I'm saying this is a kind of a 30,000-foot overview, but because each of these could be a lengthy series. But to give you the picture and to see how wisdom is layered and developed and nuanced in the scriptures and the progress of revelation. And then an overview of wisdom in the New Testament. We're going to be particularly looking at the Sermon on the Mount and also the book of James. And then finally, how do we tie this together? How do we live a life of truth, goodness, and beauty in this temporal arena? So those are the 7 components that we're going to be looking at. And in doing that then, this overview of Job, this gives us, again, the 3 fundamental components. We call it despair, debate, diagnosis. But it's really, you're dealing with a profound poetic overview in rich texture of the human quest for meaning and purpose and understanding and the apparent lack of justice in this world. And so we're going to be seeing then, as we tie those threads together in this cycle of debate, I want to give you an overview. As we have already given you a big picture of the book, I want to tie together just some of my favorite components and walk you through some of the highlights, as I see it, of this rich book. And to do so then, let me just go to then where we have a little component that we looked at a couple of weeks ago as we were doing an overview of this transforming crisis that we can see in the life of a great man who lived 4,000 years ago. And he loses, as we see, everything he has, his wealth, his family, his health. And then this sudden series of catastrophes that force him, obviously, to ask the fundamental question of why, because that's the question all of us will have to wrestle with. And we also saw that there was a sequence where we have the heavenly debate in chapters, in the first component of the book, rather. And then we also next move on to a heavenly debate, earthly debate, and then there's another heavenly perspective. Now God asks the questions of Job and forces him to wrestle with these questions of what life is truly meant to be about. So as we did this survey, the fundamental theme of the book was then to idea of trusting in God. And Job's trust in God really changes and moves from that to complaining into growing self-righteousness. We see those particularly in 32:1 and in 48. And so these are themes that are developing in the book. And then there is a point of repentance that Job then, having been given a revelation of the living God, he then repents, and consequently there is a restoration that's added, a kind of a deliverance, which makes him a kind of an icon, a prototype, an overview of the actual journey of life from the biblical point of view, which would include our heavenly home. So it becomes very profound and timeless in multiple ways. And so what we see then is the trials bring about a fundamental transformation. You can't be the same person before and after the process. You either become bitter or you become better. So there's always this process in Scripture. And then as we work through our book, then I want to just pull out some of my key passages that I've marked over the years and noted and wanted just to share with you as we develop this theme together. So we see the dilemma, the debates, and then the deliverance of Job. And the divisions then are going to be, first of all, this controversy between God and Satan, that we understand that Job is not a logical candidate for disaster. And so we have this wrestling process that goes on here. And so if we take a look at this text, the book of Job then, what we observe is certain motifs that occur in these two chapters. We've got the backdrop perspective, the point of view. And so there was a man in the name of Uz whose name was Job. It emphasizes the fact that he was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. So this sets up the issue then, and it defeats then the actual arguments that his friends are going to be using, that it must be something wrong with you. That simplistic notion, because after all, if you're not doing well, if you're not flourishing, it must be because there's sin in your life. But the text itself invites us to see that argument is unwarranted. Jumping down to verse 6, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan, or Shaitan, also came among them. And when we see that, the Shaitan is the accuser. And that's really what that idea, he comes from among them. And the sons of God, these angelic presence. And the Lord said to Shaitan, or Satan, "From where do you come?" And he answered the Lord, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." So you have this dialogue that immediately causes us to wrestle with this meaning. Why would you actually have a dialogue with this one who is seeking to destroy your purposes? Because precisely that's what he's doing, and he wants to accuse the brethren, and he's trying to find a basis for effectively arguing that that Job is in it simply because of the benefits he receives, rather than because of his true love for God. And so the fact that God is actually debating with him and allowing this shows that God has a more fundamental principle and purpose, because there's no evil force that can match the living God, that we see God's sovereign purposes accomplished even through those who are his opponents. And so that in the larger narrative then, we can see that God will be vindicated because he is the authority over all things. He's the one who made all things. And so Satan really would not be a correspondence to God in terms of power, but more like the archangel Michael. So the archangel Michael would be more of a correspondence in terms of a powerful being that was created by God, but is ultimately going to be accountable to him. And so God in the mysterious purposes allows these things for a long-term perspective that we cannot possibly ultimately embrace or grasp in our own context. So, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. So this becomes this basic motif, and of course Satan says Job's getting benefits from this, and that's why he doesn't fear you for nothing. And so we see then that he allows him to test Job, and we see then as a consequence that everything is lost. His one thing after another, the Chaldeans, various bands and so forth, and his servants, his sons and his daughters, and everything is lost. His house, his farm, everything he has. And so it tells us in verse 20 that he arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground. And what does it say? He worshipped in this incredible statement that he makes. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This is an incredible statement. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. So he understands this and has a recognition that God is to be feared and not always just understood. We can't possibly understand his ways. And so even with this then, his attitude is that he will trust in the name of the Lord, because we will believe him in the good times and in the times of pain. And then there's a second day when this occurs, and we know in the background narrative, of course, to which Job himself is not privy. So he just sees these horrible things happen. You and I are actually able to see the backdrop, the background to this story, that there's a titanic warfare in this context between heaven and earth. And so the words are very vertical in this context, very thick very rich. And so we get to see in this poetic narrative then that there is a spiritual dynamic, a warfare that is taking place, and that Satan is now seeking to destroy Job. By this time, in spite of the fact that he has lost everything, he still holds fast his integrity. Satan answered, "Skin for skin, yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now, touch his bone and his flesh, he'll curse it to your face." And again, he says he's in your power, only spare his life. So Satan has to get a permission for God to allow this to happen. He goes out from the presence of the Lord and he smites him with boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Oh, he's very thorough in this process here. And so this concept here is that he is now in such pain. His wife approaches him and she says, "You still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he says, "Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" And again, it says to us, in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. So there's a very profound statement there that we see in this material. So at the first two chapters then give us this point of view, this perspective that can help us understand where we're heading. And so we move from there then into the first cycle of debate, because indeed there are going to be 3 rounds of debate that are going to take place. And so we move from the dilemma of Job, in which Job is clearly not a logical candidate for disaster. His moral integrity, his selfless service to God, they only heighten the dilemma. So the accuser charges, as we've seen, that no one loves God from pure motives, but only for material gain. And so God allows him to strike Job with both series of assaults. And thus in his sorrow, Job laments finally the day of his birth. And so we do see that, but he does not deny God. And so there is this powerful portrait then of how you see the integrity of a righteous man. And we see the backdrop of his righteousness in the first chapter as well. So this becomes then the beginning of the first cycle of debate that takes place. And although Job's comforters reach wrong conclusions, they are his friends because they all know Job, and they were once, they're the only ones who come, it appears. They mourn with him 7 days of silent sympathy, and they confront Job without talking behind his back. But then Job breaks the silence, and that's when this 3-round debate takes place, where you have this process of the first, second, and third cycles of debate. And as we've seen then, Job is arguing then that you are my judge in this process here. He accuses his friends of judging them. And then he later appeals to the Lord as being his judge, and also the Lord, he says, is my refuge. And so you have that mindset then that God is going to be the one I'm going to appeal to. And effectively then we can see as well that God does not hear me is a theme of his in the first cycle of debate. And there are several texts that emphasize that. And then in the second round of debate, he seems to be punishing me, and so he's bringing that up in particular. And then the question is, why does he allow the wicked to flourish? And so his defenses are much longer than his friend's accusations. And in the process of defending his innocence, what happens then is he becomes guilty of a kind of self-righteousness that takes place. So let's take a look at these rounds of debate together just briefly, and get a perspective on this. So in looking at that, let's begin with the first round, which takes place in Job chapter 3 and goes up to chapter 14, verse 22. And so as we continue in our story then, Job makes this lament, and he opens his mouth, and he effectively curses the day of his birth. And he said, "Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night on which said a boy is conceived." And so he wishes that he was never born, effectively. So in his despair, he cries out. And he says effectively, and again, we can't read the whole, but in his lament, he says, "The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master." He's saying, if we could just disappear, if we could go away. Why is light given to him who suffers, he asks, and life to the bitter of soul, who long for death? But there is none, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice greatly and exult when they find the grave. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, and whom God has hedged in? So he's debating, he's wrestling, he's trying to understand what's really going on. We come to chapter 4, and there we see in chapter 4, that was really Job's first speech. And then we hear Eliphaz's first speech. So the first speech of Job we just saw in chapter 3, effectively. And then, now that Job has broken the silence, Eliphaz begins to speak. And he claims that the innocent are not going to suffer. He makes some statements here in verse 4. Your words have helped, but now it's time to come to you, and you've been impatient. So in chapter 4 and verse 6, he says, is not your fear of God your confidence and the integrity of your ways in your hope? But they're being rationalists, you see. And so he has a historical perspective, whoever did this and whoever suffered and so forth. And so he asks this question in verse 17 as well in his arguments. Can mankind be just before God? Can a man be pure before his maker? And so in his first speech then, he calls he calls Job foolish. And he encourages Job to appeal to God. And he encourages Job to don't despise God's discipline in verse 17 and following. So he says, don't despise his discipline. And so we see this following on. And so he goes on to argue then in this debate then that let me jump to verse 7 here first of all. Here, one of the well-known texts here: "Man is born for trouble as sparks fly upward. But as for me," he said, "I would seek God, and I would place my cause before God, who does great and incalculable things." So what we see here in this text then is the arguments that he's making. And he then says in verse 17, "Behold, how happy is the man whom God reproves. Do not despise the discipline of the Almighty." So there are bits of wisdom and understanding. He inflicts pain, he gives relief, he wounds, his hands also heal. And so he's effectively making a mix of wisdom and some things that are just jumping to conclusions and arguing effectively that there must be something wrong with you. It can't be something wrong with God. And so this is when Job responds to his friends, and he specifically to Eliphaz. And in his deep anguish, then he says, "You're useless to me, and I sought sympathy, I got nothing." And so in verse 10, he speaks, "It's still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain that I have not denied the words of the Holy One." And so he again is defending himself, and he's right in that respect to do so, because it seems utterly disproportionate to the injury that was taking place. And so, but he seeks his friend's sympathy, and then he questions God's ongoing trials, especially in chapter 7. So there is this dilemma that he's got here, and he wonders, isn't man forced to labor on earth? His days seem to be futile. In verse 6 specifically, "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and come to an end without hope." And I use that metaphor in many times to illustrate the idea of a weaver if you are at a loom. And I've seen this. It's fascinating to watch them, and they just they take the shuttle, they press it down, and then they shoot the shuttle across, and then press it down again, shoot it back across. And so that's an incredibly interesting metaphor for time and fast forward, when there was no such real fast forward kind of technologies. But it really is a good illustration, because if you imagine every day is just the shooting of that shuttle across, and then you push down, that day's over. Then shooting it back, yet another, pressing it down. So you can imagine that as a fast forward. That's where A.W. Tozer picked up this great metaphor from a phrase that I love in his The Pursuit of God, no, The Knowledge of the Holy. Speaking of our brevity, he says, the days of the years of our life are few and swifter than a weaver's shuttle. He speaks about how life is a short and fevered rehearsal for a concert we can't stay to give. Just when we've attained proficiency, we're forced to lay our instruments down. There's not enough time or opportunity to do all that we know that the constitution of our natures tells us we're capable of doing. In other words, we are all frustrated by the fact that we have far, far more potential than we actually can bring about in practice. That we have far more abilities than we can reveal in our accomplishments. You see, so we have all this capacity, but it seems that time cuts us short, and this is wrestling problem we all have or should be having, because it's an invitation for us to ask, why this potential? It won't be revealed in this life. My life is slipping away from me, and so that's yet another theme in the wisdom literature. And Job wrestles with God, and we wrestle with the circumstances of our life. And we recognize ultimately, though, we have a perspective that ultimately this will actually be something that will be purposed for God, in God's purpose in the economy, that we will be able to accomplish the things that we are potentially capable of doing, but not on this planet. We're in a soul-forming world, being prepared for that. And so this motif of the next life is very critical for us to understand and embrace. And this book gives us actually one of the early predictions of that and anticipations of what that would look like. So he goes on to say then that I will not restrain my mouth. And so he speaks about in his own pain and his anguish. I'll speak in the anguish of my spirit. I'll complain in the bitterness of his soul. So we're going below the waterline now. It's not just theology, it's feeling, it's imagination and so forth. And that he's arguing then that there's more going on than just right thinking. There's my emotion. And so this is the poetry, and this is the perspective that we have that touches all the levels of life, because the poetry goes beyond just the truths and the reasons and looks at the emotions and the imagination. And so he says, what is man that you magnify him, that you're concerned about him, that you examine him every morning and try him every moment? You almost want him to love him less, it seems, is this concept here. In verse 20, he says, have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target, so I'm a burden to myself? So now you begin to hear his complaints. But remember, though, he's not complaining about God. He's complaining to God, and that makes all the difference in the world. It is not as if he's just making some deliberations, philosophical deliberations and implications, but rather he's wrestling with God. And the poets and the psalmists do this, and we do well to be honest with him. Why then do you not pardon my transgression, he asks, and take away my iniquity? I lie down in the dust, and you seek me, but I will not be. And so that really is Job's deep anguish. It's his reply to Eliphaz in chapters 6 and 7. And then beginning in chapter 8, then we go to the second part, and then of that first cycle of debate. First it was Eliphaz, now it's Bildad. And he gives a speech in chapter 8 and verses 1 to 22. And so in doing that, then we see all of this, and we'll summarize what he has to say. And then Job's response. Again, there's a disproportionate amount of material concerning Job's responses to his friends. And so he answered, in truth, I know that this is so, but how can man be right before God? And so he asks this question, if one wished to dispute with him, he could not answer him once in 1,000 times. Wise in heart and mighty in strength, who has defied him without harm? And there is great wisdom in those words. And so he understands that the one who is almost now he's beginning to perceive as his opponent is one who is matchless and cannot be understood. And so we see all these great themes and things that he's done. He makes the stars. He does unfathomable things, wondrous works without number. And remember, they're able to see the Milky Way a lot better than we can without any pollution. But they never knew that the Milky Way consisted really of a galaxy with hundreds of billions of stars. There were only a few thousand stars that were visible to the naked eye. But he's astonished by the glory, as we well should be. And he says nothing really can defeat God, and God is answerable to and accountable to no person, no thing. So this is a motif then. He says nothing can refute and defeat him. And so this is, then in verse 19, he says, if it was a matter of power, behold, he's the strong one. It's a matter of justice, who can summon him? And so Job is then deliberating in front of his counselors. And in verse 32, I jump ahead there, he's not a man as I am, that I may answer him, that we may go to court together. There's no umpire between us, who may lay his hand between us both. But he wishes there were. If there was only some umpire, then perhaps I would be vindicated. So Job actually despairs of God's dealings in this whole process here, and he loathes his own life. Again, jumping through just some selected components. You've granted me life and loving kindness, and your care has preserved my spirit. Yet these things you have concealed in your heart. I know this was within me. So Job then is wrestling before God, and you've granted me life and loving kindness. Your care has actually preserved my spirit. Verse 19, he says, I should have been as though I had not been, carried from womb to tomb. Again, he goes back to that notion. Why did you bring me out into being, you see? Why not let me just be on my own? And so, of course, he's asking the impossible, that God has a purpose, but he cannot grasp what that is. So he wrestles with that in his pain. And then we have Zophar in his response then to his first speech, and that's in chapter 11. So Zophar gives a speech here, and I won't go into that material here. But in Job chapter 12, then we hear Job's response to Zophar in chapters 12 through 14. And so Job's response then, and he says, truly then you're the people, with you wisdom will die. So he's being very somewhat sarcastic, and there's more, as the debates are going to go by, it's going to be more and more heat and less light that's going to happen. But in verse 10, Job says, it's in whose hand is the life of every living thing, the breath of all mankind. He continually reviews, and you can see that Job has been meditating, as he should, on the wisdom and the greatness and the power of God. He understands this for years, from decades of fidelity and knowing God. He understands his ways. With him are wisdom and might. To him belong counsel and understanding. So he knows these truths. It was his experience, and this is why he wrestles so hard. How can then these things be? Then in continuing in his defense, he effectively says, I would speak to the Almighty. I desire to argue with God, is what he's saying in verse 3. So he now wants to somehow argue and present his case before God. And yet this incredible statement when he says in verse 15, though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. Now there's a beautiful and profound balance. Though he slays me, even in the worst case scenario, I'm still going to hope in him. To where can I go? To whom shall I turn? When all is stripped away from me, I have no other place. And there are times when that negative motivator, Lord, to whom can we go? You have words of eternal life. When you have nothing else, that's the thing that causes you to cling to his character in spite of your pain, because you know you've burned your bridges behind you. If you know the Lord, if you have transferred your trust from yourself to him, to Jesus, then you realize, apart from him, there is no life. There's no light, there's no love, there's no power, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, and there's no understanding. So this is really one of the implications of transferring our trust to him, is we've stopped trying to control the world and understand the world in our own terms. And part of the wisdom literature invites us to be that kind of a person. So we saw in this first round of debate then that there is this process by which we try to understand, but we limit God to our own understanding if we're not careful. And that's what his friends try to do, trying to come up with a simplistic, rationalistic solution. And as we'll see the book progressing, that there is no one simplistic understanding. We're going to see that the answer is going to be in the one who is being questioned, and that he is the questioner. We don't question him, that we stand before him. We are the ones who are the creation, not the creator. And so our autonomous folly and our foolish self, our independent plots and ploys and plans are just as such. They're useless, they're meaningless unless God actually is there. Then nothing will last, nothing will endure. So these are issues that we have to wrestle with and debate. I'll stop, I think, with that to open it up for some interaction with you, because the class at Christ Church stops at 10:15, and I thought perhaps it would be wise to do it that way. And then we'll pick up with the other 2 rounds of debate in the next session.
Ken?
Yes.
Last week you mentioned John 9:2, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents,
Yes.
or the blind man?
Yes.
Is that, for the blind man, is that what God did to him, similar to what God did to Job? I mean, was it something that, maybe give me more context on what Jesus meant by that, because it seemed almost like God was using that blind man.
Yes.
Right? And
yes. It's this significant thing that, again, as with Job, he does not actually provide a simplistic answer. We want to figure it out. It must be something that he's done. Maybe it's karma. It's because the idea of his parents would be almost a karmic notion. Not that they would say that or believe that, and yet they're trying to figure out what's the source of this difficulty. If God is righteous, then how was he born blind? He didn't deserve it, didn't warrant it. So instead of answering that question, he's saying that there is a purpose that God has, and that God's works will be displayed in him. And so instead of saying to him, you're going to understand this, you might as well ask him how you can understand how he can make something that's dead come to life, something that is incomprehensible. His works reveal his power and his wisdom. We can't begin to grasp that. So instead, what Jesus then is applies that to the situation, that we must work the works of him who sent me. So while I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. So he's saying effectively that God allows these things in our lives for purposes that we cannot begin to ourselves understand or comprehend. But the difference is that God does. And what is not understandable or achievable or manageable by human comprehension, it's telling us that the very one who holds the cosmos together is the one who so transcends our minds, our imaginations. Even if I were to tell you, you couldn't begin to understand my answer. And so effectively, it's parrying that to the question of what are we to do, work the works of him while it is day. And then this is done then to the glory of God, as we know in this context. The same is true in Luke chapter 13, where we saw this before as well. Remember the 2 kinds of evil, that you have moral evil and you also have natural evil. So he begins with moral evil and speaks about this question. What about that, this evil that Pilate instigated then? Well, the victims of that evil, were they worse than the others who didn't have that fate? The one who were not killed? Instead of answering the question, he says, I tell you, no, that will not be so. That's not the answer. That's too simplistic. We want black and white clarity, rationalism. That's the comforters, the so-called comforters of Job, trying to get answers on our terms. We will never get that. The point of the book is, once you come to know the one who made all things, then you begin to realize who you are in this world, and that you have no right or authority to actually try to get God to come to the bar of your reasoning. But rather, he is the one who judges you. It's the imagery. I remember stories about people who were at painting exhibitions, and I'm told of one Rembrandt exhibition at a famous museum where the guard was quietly listening to people's comments about some of the paintings of Rembrandt. And he quietly said, it's not the paintings that are on trial, it's the viewers. And so it's an interesting way of seeing that. The concept is that God's not on trial, we are. And there's going to be the question of whether we will grasp our true position in this world, whether we will humble ourselves. And so we saw, no, unless you repent, what's the application? You need to see that this could have happened to you, and you need to then look at any situation around you and say, there but for the grace of God go I, but you can also recognize what recalibration do I need to make in light of this reality, so that pain that I observed, there's a message. And then he gives the example of natural evil, so the two fundamental kinds of evil, moral evil and then natural evil. And he gives the same answer. And he speaks about this 18, the tower in Siloam fell and killed them. They happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Were they worse people? Of course not, he says. Again, he says to you, no, the precise same answer. But unless you repent, turn around, unless you recalibrate, unless you, when you see pain and suffering and sorrow, it's an invitation for you to recalibrate your own perspective and your own orientation before God. As well as interceding for others, we can also then refix our own destination. So I'm glad you asked that, because that's a fundamental question. It's an example of the very thing that Job's so-called comforters were trying to do, trying to come up with simplistic, rationalistic explanations for that which is utterly mysterious.
And I have the same problem with Satan and having access to God.
Yes, that makes no sense to me. If I were God, would I want Satan in front of my throne, having access to come up to me and then accuse the ones that I love? That's nutty. I wouldn't want to be, but I'm not God, and we want to be thankful that I'm not, because if I were God and I saw the absurdity in this world, I'd thump it out of existence.
So we don't have any true answers
of course
to
not.
This exchange between God and Satan.
No, we just know this, that Satan is being used because even the wrath of man will praise him. So he's using even his enemies, even angels who rebelled against him, are ultimately going to serve his purposes, because he's the creator and they are not. They are accountable to him, not the other way around. And that's why every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, they're all going to give an account before God. And as well, everyone on earth and above the earth and below the earth will, in fact, bow the knee to Jesus. So that's an inevitability, including all things, including those who are at enmity with God in this life. All will then have to bow the knee, and they'll realize they were wrong. They had it was right in front of them and they didn't see it. So it comes down to a bowing of the will, about the letting loose of the absurdities of self-magnification and of supposing that the world is here for me, that the world is about me. So that's really what it comes down to again, is the autonomous self versus the surrender and submission to that which I don't understand. Should I expect to understand God any more than understand these things? And the answer is no. But what I must do then, when I read Job, when I read these texts, I need to look at my life, I look at the world around me, and the application is still there. The principles haven't changed in these thousands of years. Submitting myself to God, and only when I let loose of trying to argue with it and to make sense of it, then I hold the both ends of life together, that he is both sovereign and yet we are still also accountable. Those mysteries I have to hold in a radical tension.
Ken, one quick question. Why does God use hardship to prepare us for future blessings?
Yes.
Is that on the earth or in heaven?
God knows. The blessings... Essentially, we don't have the promises. We haven't. All these died without receiving the promises. So to get that answer to that good question, we turn to Hebrews chapter 11, and we remember a couple of significant points about it. Number one, without faith it's impossible to please God, because he who comes must believe that he is, that he's a rewarder. So that we come to God and that we discover that life is about him. And then, having done so, then we see these exemplars of people who died in faith without receiving the promises. The summary verse in verse 13, all these died in this faith without receiving them, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. So thus we are saying that we are seeking a country that is not on this earth, not something on this planet, that we are wayfarers and strangers. So clearly then that metaphor is that in this world you and I are pilgrims and sojourners, and we are ultimately being prepared for our citizenship, our eternal home in the Father's house. We've already been adopted, and we are already there in our spirits, but we await then in this soul-forming world in which we're being shaped by the adversities we go through. He knows exactly what each person needs, but has an understanding that we can't even begin to calculate, so that we have to then surrender and submit. Why is it that one person suffers so much and another one seems so little, yet they're both believers, let's say? It is not for me to try to understand that nuanced change, because God has a unique purpose for each person, and ultimately we will all be satisfied. And this is a critical theme. It's my absolute conviction that when we stand before the living God, we will be satisfied, and we will realize that he does all things well.
And
Yes.
the scripture you put up there that we slay me,
Yes.
Where's that in Job again?
Yes, let me get that for you, because that is one of the most powerful statements you're going to find when you hear him. This is his true heart, and yet he says that in chapter 13 and verse 15. Notice the thing. I'm still going to argue my ways before him, but I'm going to hope in him. You see, because he knows, Job, that all his life, all these decades, God has been faithful. And suddenly this thing happens. And then he even asks his wife, shall we only trust God in times of plenty and not in adversity? It would be folly. Yet at the same time, you begin to see, as he especially is being aggravated and insulted by his friends, who begin to become more and more accusatory, and thus he becomes more self-defensive until he becomes self-righteous. But he will argue his ways, but at the same time, he has to come to understand that he can't understand. And that's really what our point is too. The point of the book is he will see, doesn't get answers to why these things happen, but instead has an encounter with the one who makes all things. And it's this encounter that's the point and purpose of the book, that you must understand. You don't understand his ways, even the fringe of his ways, and yet you can trust in him. Now, we have a richer point of view, a richer perspective than they had. It's richer precisely because we see things that Job couldn't have even begun to imagine. And so when we look at a play and we recognize that if there are several acts, you don't judge the play when you're in the second act. You have to look at the final act, and only then can you begin to see it. And so the 4 acts that I've often shown you then, Job here is not capable of seeing this dynamic of redemption. There is this motif of redemption. It's something's going on. But who could imagine that the very God he's complaining to is the one who's going to actually underwrite the cost of his own pain? No one could even dream this. This is stuff no one could have thought of or ever did. It's utterly unique in all the world. The concept that God is the one who pursues us, and that we don't make the sacrifice for him, he makes the sacrifice for us. This is something beyond our comprehension, indeed. But Job only sees then a portion of the puzzle, and you and I, even with the fullness of revelation, see only a portion of the truth, isn't it so? Because we have an understanding with the progress of revelation, with greater clarity of what's going to take place, and we can certainly see Revelation 20 to 22, and we have a sense of what God's going to do, and we very, very clearly see that there will be no longer any world, any flesh, any devil as systems that are opposed to him, and that his people then will never die, and that they will then be body in the resurrected body, a body of the new order of creation, a new physics, as well as their soul and then their spirit. Our spirits are already seated with him in the heavenlies, but we are still in process of soul forming, so that then we will be made complete. Who could have guessed this? Job would have not understood that. Although we'll see his desire, though, to see God, as we'll see in this in chapter 19, when he speaks about this aspect. And it's really quite an incredible statement that he makes, because if I go to Job 19, just jumping ahead, though, from what we will be looking at next time, when we see Job, and he's making this statement here, that my Redeemer lives, my words, and he says, my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he'll take his stand in the earth. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I will see God, whom I myself shall behold, whom my eyes will see and not another. My heart faints within me. That's an amazing statement, and it's the really one of the most profound texts in the Hebrew Bible that gives us an insight into an intimation of some resurrection. So it's a very profound statement. Somehow he's going to see God. And so his eyes will see and not another.
It's like Abraham, right?
It's
Same
like,
thing.
yeah.
His son, I'm going to believe him. He believed in the resurrection.
Yes, and that's what it tells us, because as Hebrews gives us an understanding, you know that God would be able to even bring him back from the dead. It's interesting, isn't it, that with that text, if you go to Hebrews, back to Hebrews chapter 11, the exemplar you just brought up with Abraham, because it tells us that by faith, when he was tested, he received him, and it was like, and he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he received him back as a type. Now, the text in the Hebrew Bible doesn't make that statement, but this is what is connecting with that. Because he knew that if it was so, that if God promised that it would be through Jacob that your descendants will be called, then, in Isaac rather, then how would it be possible for him to kill Isaac and then have that promise take place? The only way would be for God then to bring him back from the dead. So again, there's a profundity in this context in which they have so little light in comparison to what you and I are privileged to have. What amazes me, by the way, when I think about that light, is how they had less and yet they applied more in many ways. Part of the point of Job, as we'll see, and God's questionings of Job, especially in chapters 38 and following, are the visible world that he's made that points beyond itself to the invisible maker. And their appreciation of that and leveraging the beauty and the amazement of the physical world, that's what is seen as a pointer to that which is unseen. And that's what I seek to do now more than ever, especially now that we live in a time in which there's unprecedented amount of knowledge, and it's going up exponentially, so that we live in a time where our vast growth in knowledge is such that we can now appreciate on each order of magnitude beauty and wonder and things that we couldn't have even dreamed of even a decade ago. So we're privileged to see vastly more on the macrocosm, the microcosm, the midicosm than these biblical writers ever knew. And yet, we're not very doxological. Those people who appreciate the beauty of plants, for example, or the beauty of insects, or whatever it might be, trees, those people who seem to love that and see that beauty and are wonder and amazed at it are often, though not doxological, they often don't point to the God who made it. So where are the people then who really do have such a passion and a desire to use these as works, the glory of God, to leverage that into praise and prayer and wonder? And that's what I'm seeking to do myself, and beginning to just immerse myself in that. So if I see what God's made, if I can't understand his ways and his works, it's an astonishment. Let me see if I can find something for you that will illustrate something. I just took this photo quite recently here. See if I can find the photo for you here. Change things around here for my library. It's not quite the way I want. Here I go. Just some photos I took just the other day here. I got to say, I love that thing. That's but let me see. This extraordinary wonder, this Malaysian orchid just astonishes me, and I was taking some more recent pictures of it. I don't seem to see them right here. Sorry to say. If I go to the library here, and if I go to my favorites, I'm sorry, I can't seem to summon them up right now. I have to. Here's the favorites here, but that's still not what I'm looking for. We'll worry about that later on. But I'm astonished at the glory and the beauty of the living God. That's how He's able to make things and wonders that are beyond belief, that astonish me, that marvel. And I think that's part of what we want to do as well, is to be able to train ourselves to appreciate that and to leverage this vastly new knowledge. Yes, this is what I was looking for. So you look at this Malaysian orchid, and look at the symmetry that you have on every angle, so that you have this vertical and horizontal, and then depth symmetry. So you look at that, and so look at the structure of this, where it has 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 down. The structure, what can make this thing in space and time so perfectly reified, so perfectly brought into pattern? And it's more than the DNA. These are body plans that no one understands, the epigenetics of this, how it's actually manifests itself. And so you see, again, this glorious symmetry, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. And then the plants that emerge from this. These are just pictures I took just yesterday, and you see everything is filled with wonder and awe and magic and marvel. So I say that, I guess, because I have to train myself to have the seeing eye. I believe that God has, as I've said this multiple times, has ordered this created world, this visible world in which we're immersed, to point beyond itself on everything we look at, for those who have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. A friend of mine just took this picture of this caterpillar, and it's, again, a wonder and a marvel. And we can't even begin to understand the purposes and all that's involved in that. But then the leaf's not unimpressive either, because if you studied that, you'd realize that every cell within that and all the thousands and thousands are just, but then the structure, how it works together in creating this order. In other words, we're immersed in it, and very few people notice it. And I think we need to start training ourselves to do that, because much of God's answer has to do with leveraging the visible world in chapters 38 and following to appreciate the invisible world. I think that's a wise thing for us to do as well.
Ken,
Yes.
what I'm gathering, or what the Spirit is trying to teach me,
Yes.
is that there are certain characteristics that I must possess in order for me to please the Lord.
Yes.
And I guess the only way to acquire those characteristics within myself is to stay, I guess, committed to His Word. Is that correct?
Well, I would say for us to, yes, to renew our minds, we've got to constantly, and this has to do with various things and methods we can do to pray Scripture back to God. Without the renewal of the mind, without an exposure to the written Word. See, so what we have now is the physical world, the visible world, pointing to the unseen world. And that unseen world is actually then something that we can now explore and understand because of God's revelation through the prophets and ultimately pointing to Yeshua. And so here we're privileged then to have a Bible, and we can just read this book and encounter God, the one who made it. And so we can have an immersive experience with this. So we need to continue to train ourselves, to habituate ourselves, to practice His presence, and to begin to train ourselves so that everything you see in the natural world begins to become more and more. You have a growing skill in seeing a spiritual lesson in that. Something that's there, it's been there all along, and we just didn't see it. So when I see something like this, it was there, I never noticed it before. And I'm just saying, you're surrounded by such marvels and wonders in this world. Anything you touch in the created order. So there is the visible world, to doxological, to glorify God in all the beauty that He's made, but also glorify God in our thinking and our actions, our attitudes. And that requires the renewal of the mind, and that requires the special revelation that feeds our souls and trains us and empowers us to be His people. So to me, that's a kind of a both-and process.
Ken, what does it mean to be tested? How do we apply that in our lives? Because sometimes when I was reading when God tests Job, is he just trying to do like a mathematical, yes, he's going to do this, or is it, I'm going to clean the dross from his life? I mean, how do we apply that in our
Yeah,
lives?
because he's not wondering about us. He's revealing ourselves to ourselves. And through the test, then we discover our true mettle. And so this is why the testing will reveal that we may have been hoping in the wrong thing all along. And so sometimes his severe mercy, where he strips away many things that we thought were ours by desert, we realize it was actually given to us by God's grace, and we begin to have a different perspective. What we took for granted, suddenly now we're dethroned, and we're forced now to enthrone him. Even in the pain of that adversity, we have to surrender to him because we know that we're totally out of control. And so it's his severe mercy that drives us to a conscious existential awareness of our true condition, which is desperation. We've always been desperate. We've always been people of need, often though we don't see it because we have a thick carapace that protects us from reality. So in breaking through that and breaking us into and through pain, then he gets our attention. And when that occurs, there's a redemptive purpose always. He does, and you don't want to waste the pain by missing the lesson. But we're out of time. We'll pick up next week. But I'm glad because these questions are good. You're asking the right questions. You're wrestling with the right issues because that's what Job has to do as well as he wrestles with these things.